Hello, everyone. I'm Randy Rosenbaum, Executive Director of the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts. We're pleased to bring you this grant workshop online to give you a sense of what is happening with our upcoming grant application deadline of April 1st. Next slide, please. First, a bit of information about who we are. So RISCA stands for the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, and we are a state agency where we've been in existence for over 50 years, and we are supported by appropriations from both Rhode Island state government and also from the National Endowment for the Arts, our federal funding partner. With these funds, we provide grants, we provide technical assistance, programs and services, and also support from our staff members to arts organizations, artists, schools, community centers, social service organizations, local governments, and pretty much anybody who's doing arts programming in and for Rhode Islanders. We exist to ensure that the arts are part of the lives of all people in the state of Rhode Island. Next slide, please. We provide grants in a variety of programmatic areas. We support nonprofit organizations. We support individual artists. We give grants in education, both for teacher training and also for artists and residents in school settings. We provide grants in healthcare for arts in healthcare settings. And we also provide support for folk and traditional artists and art forms to ensure that they are able to continue and grow and prosper. In all of our granting programs, art is at the center. We are an arts council. When you apply to us for support, it is about the art itself. We are an arts funder and we fund arts projects and programs. Next slide, please. We have two major deadlines in our funding year. The first deadline is April 1st, in this case, April 1st of 2021. And these are to fund projects that occur between July 1, 2021 and June 30th of 2022, which is the entirety of the state's fiscal year. We also have another deadline, and that deadline is in October 1st of 2021. And that's for projects that occur between January 1st of 2022 and June 30th of 2022, again, within the confines of the state fiscal year. Every grant we award requires a final report, and those final reports are typically due either when the project is completed or within 30 days after the end of the fiscal year, which in this case would be final reports due on July 31st of 2022. Next slide, please.
Grants for individuals are small grants of $500 to $3,000 for artists or groups of artists that are doing work that's directly publicly engaged without support of other institutional structures. This means if you're going to do if you're looking for support to frame artwork for a gallery show, this is not the grant program for you. If you're looking to do a dance performance in public on the streets of Kennedy Plaza, like you see in the picture, this grant is for you. Next slide, please. This year, there will be only one application deadline, April 1st, instead of project grants for individuals having applications due on both April 1st and October 1st. So deadline April 1st for projects happening between July 1st, 2021 and June 30th, 2022. Next slide, please. And as we all are incredibly aware, y'all are creating artwork in the time of a pandemic. So particularly since we're a state agency, all projects we fund must be in conformity with the current safety standards and regulations at the state and city level. We know that these regulations are shifting, sometimes day to day, definitely week to week. They'll definitely shift between April 1st and whenever you do your project after July 1st, 2021. So what we're asking for is sort of a best case scenario project as you envision it now. And then we're going to ask you a question about how you'll pivot your project based on the current state level regulations at the time of your project. We don't expect fully fleshed out plans here, just some ideas about how you'll pivot if you need to reduce in-person audience size, if you need to move completely online, that sort of thing. Next slide.
Hi, this is Todd Trevor. I'm the Organizations Program Director at RISCA, and I manage the Arts Access Grant Program. The Arts Access Grant Program is similar in character to the project grants for individuals. It's intended to support publicly engaged arts and cultural programs around the state. Any nonprofit organization can apply for these grants, or a fiscally sponsored organization, one that is fiscally sponsored by a nonprofit, can apply as well. These grants are for up to $3,000, and they support a broad range of programs. They support anything from festivals, such as historically, and frequently we've supported the Rhode Island Cape Verdean Heritage Subcommittee Cape Verdean Heritage Festival in the summer. Oasis International's African Summer Bash has been funded previously. We've also supported things such as Burbage Theater Company's Shakespeare in the Park and those kind of outdoor summer experiences. On the other end of the spectrum, in terms of number of people affected by a given program, we've also supported things such as Refocus's Little Clay Studio for developmentally disabled adults, as well as other smaller programs that have a more specific target audience. So publicly engaged takes a lot of different meanings. It doesn't mean a ton of people per se, but it can mean that as well. But it can also mean a smaller group of people being served with depth and focus of a program. The Arts Access Grants have two deadlines, one at April 1st and the other at October 1st. As I mentioned, you must be a nonprofit or fiscally sponsored by a nonprofit organization. For those of you who are unclear what that means, let me just give you, actually, I'll give you more information on the next slide about it. Similar to what Molly mentioned about the project grants for individuals, you're going to have to discuss how the program might change and be modified by the pandemic. So as Molly said, it's similar for Arts Access Grants. You're going to discuss your best case scenario in your application, and there will be a question where you'll be asked to discuss how you might pivot your program should health guidelines change and prohibit you from doing your program live or in a format that you have planned. For the April 1st, 2021 deadline, the one-to-one cash match that's a part of the Arts Access Grants has been waived. The cash match, and what that means is that for every dollar an organization or an applicant requests from RISCA, they have to show that they have another dollar of income coming in to support the project as well. And that money could be requested money, it could be projected money. For instance, if you're projecting ticket revenue, or if you're projecting donations to support a project, all of that is totally fine. But you don't have to worry about that for this cycle, because as I mentioned, that cash match requirement has been waived because we recognize that in the pandemic, arts and culture programs are having a challenging time raising funds, and many of them have lost sponsors that they historically have had to support programs that they do. So changes to fiscal sponsorship and a little bit about what fiscal sponsorship is. So for those of you who this idea is new to you, if you are not a nonprofit organization, but you are an organization or a group of artists, you can apply for a grant from RISCA using another nonprofit as a fiscal agent. What that means is the nonprofit functions sort of like how a grown-up in your life might have functioned when you were a kid. If you had someone send you a check in the mail, like your grandma, for your birthday, you couldn't cash that check. You didn't have a bank account. So you gave it to a grown-up in your life so that they could do that for you. That's essentially what happens here, where a nonprofit will receive the check on your behalf and cash it, and then make whatever checks it needs to for you to accomplish your grant program. It is your responsibility to find an organization to be your fiscal sponsor and to work at the details of that relationship, but I can help you in that conversation 100%. Something for you to know, and this is the change that's highlighted on this slide, is that organizations currently receiving funding from RISCA may now function as fiscal sponsors for organizations within other grant programs, as long as they are not program partners in the sponsored projects. And this is true for all the project grants for organizations that we will discuss today. We made this change because we recognized that it was prohibitive to limit organizations as fiscal sponsors to be those which were not receiving funds from RISCA, because many of the obvious people to be fiscal sponsors for many groups of artists or nonprofit organizations in the arts and culture sphere were going to be other arts and culture organizations. We also wanted to allow for organizations that apply for grants in the same program to also be fiscal sponsors as well. So we've seen that happen since this change has been made. Again, if you have more questions about that, you can just sign up for a time to meet me or reach out to me and we can talk more about it.
Hello, I'm Maggie Anderson, and I am the Arts and Education Programs Director. The Project Grants in Education has two routes. We have standard project grants in education, for which applications are eligible to apply. And then we also have a subcategory called Project Grants in Education for individuals. This year, we will be able to hold two cycles, one at April 1st and then again at the October 1st deadline. Our Project Grants in Education program is a maximum grant of $10,000 to support teaching artists or cultural organizations who are collaborating with schools and other educational facilities and entities to increase the access to high quality arts education experiences that build off of the existing classroom curriculum for a set group of students. These grants, we typically encourage the schools to apply for, and there is a one-to-one match for the total ask of the grant. So for example, if a school is requesting the full $10,000, the school has to have matching funds, either in cash or in kind, and I'll talk about that a little more, of $10,000. So the total program budget would be $20,000. The match can be broken down 50-50. So if I'm asking for 10, I need to have at least $5,000 in cash in my budget, and I can have up to $5,000 in in-kind support. So the example that we typically give in this category is that if we're putting a temporary mural out in front of a building, the large, plywood wall might be being supplied by a Home Depot or a local hardware store, and the value of that could count as an in-kind contribution. We ask that in this category, the artist or arts organization is having a minimum of 10 sequential curriculum-based experiences with the same set of students. And I'll talk a little bit more in the 2 slides from now about what that might look like during the pandemic. Next slide, please. We also have a subcategory of our Project Grants in Education for individuals. This also will have an April 1st and October 1st deadline. This program came out of our Project Grants in Education for organizations. What we were hearing from our teaching artist community is that schools were often very excited about engaging them, but either couldn't come up with operational funds on their own to pay the teaching artist. Maybe there was no PTO in the school that the artist was approaching, or the school didn't feel comfortable at the time being an applicant for a PGE. So this subcategory is intended for individual artists to be the applicant. They can ask for a maximum of $3,000, and the program that they're asking to be funded must be a pilot. So again, to use the mural example, if I'm the muralist going to work with students in a school, and again, engaging them in arts learning that builds on their existing curriculum, it needs to be the first time I've done this program with this school. So it needs to be a pilot program, and all of the funding goes directly to the individual artist in lieu of the school supporting this program. Because that's the case, there is no match required for individual artists applying here, and that's similar to project grants and project grants for individuals that we opened this slideshow talking about. Next slide, please. So just a quick note about this category during COVID-19. While we acknowledge the massive impact that COVID has had on what education looks like right now for our students and certainly our education community at large, we also understand that there will be elements of particularly distance learning and virtual art making experiences that will exist in the coming years. And so because that's the case, and we're sort of right in the middle of all this right now in our education sector, we didn't feel it was appropriate to change the guidelines for this funding program right now. So if you're a previous applicant in this category, you'll see that the questions that we ask and the narrative that we ask you to write and the supporting documents that we ask you to submit with your application are the same as they've been in past years. To that end, we are making the assumption that you will write your narrative and talk about your project with some depth of understanding around the school reopening guidelines. And so we direct you to be sure you're checking with backtoschoolri.com for the most current COVID guidelines. And we are also encouraging organizations and schools with teaching artists or individuals working as teaching artists with our students here in the state to consider coming in for a PGA, which is the Project Grants and Education for Individuals. We're recommending this because should the project be funded, it seems to us that it will be much easier for people to pivot if they need to be, if the individual artist is driving the program. We also don't have the match requirement in that category. And in this time of limited funding for education experiences, we want to make sure we're seeing our teaching artists be paid. And so please feel free to sign up with me to talk more about which of the two categories you should explore if you'd like to do an arts learning project with students this year. Next slide.
It's Randy Rosenbaum again. Project Grants in Healthcare is a relatively new program for the Arts Council. These are grants that provide opportunities for teaching artists to work in hospitals or other healthcare settings, such as hospices, community health agencies, clinics, that kind of thing. This is an opportunity for teaching artists to partner with licensed healthcare staff to put together and implement projects. Some examples of what we have funded in this category in the past include a grant to CareLink in East Providence for a Dance for Parkinson's community group, such as you see on the screen here. We've also supported Coast in South Kingstown for a peer drama therapy workshop, grant to Bradley Hospital for their healing arts program, another grant to Hasbro Children's Hospital for a therapeutic music and pediatric surgical services program. These are opportunities for artists to work in healthcare settings with arts-based professional development with staff at the healthcare facility, which is also strongly encouraged. Next slide, please.
Sorry, this is Maggie Anderson again. So we just wanted to make you aware that outside of the spring deadline, the April 1st deadline, there are other programs and funding opportunities for artists and organizations. And we encourage you to go to arts.ri.gov and look under the programs tab for more information about the topics you see listed here. So again, this is Maggie Anderson. I'm going to talk a little bit about the application process. The first thing you're going to hear from me and my colleagues is that we actively encourage you to read the directions. It's important for you to know that the directions for the grant applications, or the guidelines as we call them, and we'll call them throughout this presentation, are the exact documents that panelists get when they review your application. And so we have clearly articulated eligibility right up front in those directions. So we encourage you to start and thoroughly read the guidelines, because we'd hate for you to log into the online application and get started only to find out that your particular project or organization isn't eligible at this time. We also encourage you to take advantage of talking to a staff member. It is our job to ensure that we're available to help you through this grant process. I'll say this again, but no RISCA staff make any funding determinations during this process. And so it is our responsibility responsibility to the applicants to make sure that they feel supported. And you'll see at the end of this slideshow, there's a number of ways you can reach out to us in advance of April 1st. Our applications are all online, so you're going to have to create a profile on our grant application, which is called Foundant. The easiest way to link to that is through the grants page on our website. So then you'll take some time to write the application and gather the support materials. While that's happening, you're welcome to reach out to us and ask us to look at a draft. We encourage you to do that in advance, well in advance of the application date, but we can let you know, or we can let you know how you're doing and offer you some feedback there. And then you're going to hit the submit button before the deadline. For the April 1st deadline, the hard deadline is April 1st, 2021 at 11:59 p.m. You need to know that the portal closes at 11:59 and 1 second. So we are actively encouraging you to make sure you're not waiting to the last minute or last second to submit. And then you're going to wait approximately 2 months. And while you're waiting, I can tell you a little bit about what's going on the backside. Next slide, please. So what happens is after your application is reviewed for eligibility and completeness, it goes to the panel review process. Panelists will review applications and recommend funding. RISCA staff does not do that. RISCA staff is in the panel room, and in this case, in the panel Zoom, to take detailed notes and provide information from the application as appropriate. The council, our governing council, will review the recommendations that each panel has made for each granting category and say yay or nay to those funding recommendations, and typically yay. And then we tell you whether or not your grant has been funded. For the April 1st deadline, this typically happens mid to late June, and checks are not released until July, which is when we will mail you a check. It's going to take 6 to 8 weeks after you submit everything to the state financial processing systems, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, to get that money. You do the project in the allotted amount of time, and then you report back to us on the success of your project at the end of the following fiscal year. So for these applications, your final report would be due June 30th, 2022. Next slide, please. After you get a grant, you'll get a notification from us saying that you've been recommended for funding, and you will sign a grant agreement. This all happens through the grants portal, and you'll register with a different portal for financial payments called Ocean State Procurers. We'll send you all of the directions and some troubleshooting support on how to do that. You have to know that we can't send you any of the money until the grant agreement is signed and you're registered with Ocean State Procurers. At any point after grant decisions have been announced, you can reach out to your program director and ask them any questions you may have about panel comments. You're going to communicate with your program director throughout the grant period if there are any changes to your project. This isn't intended to be us checking up on you, and it's never punitive. It's just so that you don't have to do a lot of explaining when it comes time for the final report. You can keep us in the loop on the way there. We would love for you to let us know when your program events are happening, and if appropriate, we'll amplify it on our social media pages. And then we never go away. You can always ask us questions. We'll be here to support you throughout the entire process, even after funding. Next slide, please. If you didn't get the grant, we're still available to you in the exact same ways. So you can reach out to us to learn more about the panel comments and get more feedback. And then we would actively encourage you to apply again. I'll talk about this some more, but it's important to know that every single panel is comprised of different individuals, and therefore, just because you were unsuccessful in one grant review doesn't mean you'll be unsuccessful at the next deadline. We have our meetings about grants deadline as soon as the grants open, which at April 1 is typically February 1. So we encourage you to meet with us earlier in February than later, but we're still here for you. Next, please. Okay. It's important to note that even though it varies by program, almost all of the awards in the grant categories we discussed today are partially funded. That's for a couple of reasons. One, it's important to us that we are getting funding to as many artists and arts organizations in the state as we can, but also we have a limited budget as well. If you're partially funded and you can, scale back your project and keep it within the spirit of what you proposed in the application and still pull it off, we really encourage you to do that. If you're partially funded and the award is not big enough for you to complete any component of your project that meets mission, nothing bad will happen to you. We'll definitely want you to let us know, and then you're able to decline your grant. There's no consequence for this, and it doesn't reflect on the next time you apply with us. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we put together a panel? Typically, there's 5 panelists for each grant panel. They're Rhode Island residents who have many different arts and cultural involvement touch points. These panels are assembled with an eye to diversity in many forms. And so what we mean by that is we're talking about racial diversity, gender diversity, age diversity, industry diversity. We want each category to be well represented by expertise in whatever way that presents itself. Panelists can only serve once every 3 years. Decisions vary based on the composition of the panel. So this is what I was saying before, that if you're not funded by one panel, it doesn't hold any bearing on the next panel at the next application deadline. And again, just to underline, we never make any funding decisions. Next slide. The panelists get an invitation to participate sent to them directly by each program staff. Each panelist receives the guidelines, so the exact same documents and directions that you use as an applicant are the documents and directions that the panelists use in their training. They receive access to the applications via the online grant system very soon after the April 1st deadline. Then panelists are asked to review and pre-score applications at home in their leisure time. But we'd like you to know that we estimate that panelists spend about 30 minutes per application, and we are going to ask them to submit to review between 20 and 35 applications. So we ask you to keep that in mind when you're thinking of things like support materials. You want things to be really attention grabbing, but also direct. And then panelists meet for an all-day in-person review session, although in this case, it'll be done virtually via Zoom. They discuss, and then if appropriate, based on the discussion, they rescore each application. The total or average scores are tabulated and then displayed for all the panelists to see together. And then funding recommendations for each application based on the total budget from RISCA and how applications were scored. That's how the funding process comes together.
Okay, this is Molly. I'm the Individual Artist Program Director, and I'm here to talk you through some grant tips. The first one, which is pretty clear here, is what if you're late submitting? The big answer is nope. So the online grant portal will actually close submissions at 11:59 p.m. in 1 second. This means we can't go back in, we can't make exceptions if your computer dies at 11:45 p.m., if your internet crashes at 11:35 p.m., if something bad happens close to the deadline, you're out of luck. So we strongly encourage you to submit at least a couple hours ahead of the deadline. I will also say that while we do offer a ton of support up until the April 1st deadline, we do not offer support at 11 p.m. on the deadline day. I say here we go home around 5 p.m. on the deadline day. We're all working from home, but we'll log off of our computers at our normal work time. I will say that some of us will do our best to answer email until we go to sleep that night. Don't count on it. And then just the application does close at 11:59 p.m. Make sure you hit submit by 11:58. Next slide, please. Okay, as Maggie mentioned, my #1 grant writing tip is to thoroughly read and follow the directions. This includes the grant guidelines. This includes formatting of file attachments, character counts, what the questions being asked are. You really want to make sure that you are following the directions that will give you the biggest head start on grants. And this is not just for RISCA, this is any grant you're writing ever. Next slide, please. Okay, secondary to reading and following the directions, some other things that will help you write a successful grant application include being excited about your project as you're writing it. The panel is comprised of folks who work in the arts or arts adjacent fields. They are already deeply believing that art is important and paying artists is important. So they're going to go in being excited about your project. They want you to be excited as well. Address the grant application questions directly and fully. There's a reason that those specific questions are being asked. They generally relate to the evaluation rubric the panelists are using to score your application. So make sure you answer those questions. It's not a political debate, right? It's a grant application. Have an outsider read your application. This means someone who's not your partner, who's not the person you share a studio with, who's not working with you on the application, but someone that might or might not have an arts background, but definitely isn't an expert in your specific field and doesn't already know about your project. This way you can make sure that you're addressing the forest, right, instead of just the trees. We want to make sure that the panelists can see what the big picture of your project is and why you think it's important and how you're going to accomplish it rather than the minuscule details. Please fully address the public value of the project. For arts access grants and project grants for individuals, the public value is 1/4 of your score. There are questions in the application specifically about this. In project grants in healthcare, it's connection to patient success, I believe. I'm not sure exactly what the wording is, yikes. And for education, it's curriculum connection. But you really want to think about who this is for and why. And the answer is not, it's for everyone because. We encourage you to look at the panelist rubric before you write your application and refer to it throughout the process. So the rubric that the panelists are using to score your application is available on our website. It's slightly different for every single grant program, but it's right there for you. You can see exactly how panelists are going to score. Please look at that to see how you should be answering questions. Next slide, please. Okay, grant writing tips, more. Don't wait for the last minute. I already covered this one. Communicate with your program staffer. It is literally our job to help you. Maggie covered that pretty thoroughly. But again, don't wait for the last minute. We can give you feedback on your application. We can answer questions. We all have a ton of meetings and drop-in hours and support for that. However, we probably won't, if you reach out to us at noon on the day of the deadline, we probably won't be able to read your application and give you substantive feedback, right? Just because of the amount of folks we're trying to help at that point. Next slide, please. Image submissions. So for the fellowships, which we do not have open this grant cycle, image quality is everything. That being said, for folks submitting in other grant programs, the important things are to know that you need to follow the directions on file size, format, and naming. The grant system will just not include your files if you attach them in the size that's over the stated size limit or in a format other than the stated formats it accepts. We run into this problem a lot with budgets and folks submitting them using the program numbers, which is the Apple version of Excel. The online grant system literally cannot read that, and so it just won't attach, and there's no way for us to recover it. So please make sure you're paying attention to limits on file size and format. Know that the panelists are looking at your application on their laptops or home computers, and then once they're in the panel room, which we won't be this year, they'll look at it together on a large TV. We recommend if the artwork is really complex or large in scale to include detail shots or installation shots. Perhaps a video. There are ways to submit that through Google Drive or links. Next slide, please. Todd, I'm sending it to you.
Yep. So Todd Trebor here, Organizations Program Director, jumping back in. So we've talked a lot about narrative questions, certainly, and then Molly just talked about images. An important part of a grant application that can often be overlooked as being important by applicants and also by panelists, although we orient them to absolutely look at them and consider as a part of an application, are the support materials. So again, Molly and Maggie went over tips for the narrative questions that you will be responding to, but support materials such as images, resumes for artists, reviews of work you've done in a newspaper, letters of support, et cetera, which I'll talk a little bit more about, are all things that can enliven your application. As Maggie said, you want to be aware of how many applications these individuals are reading and how much time they're going to be spending on the applications. So you're going to want to tailor your support materials in that way. You want to be sure they help tell the story of your work, your project, or your organization. And again, as I said, remembering the audience in terms of their attention span and time. So for instance, for arts access grants, there are 5 support material slots in the application. Some other programs have more, but you want to be mindful of what kind of material you're putting in each slot in terms of how big it is. So, you might have 10 letters of support. A panel is not going to read all 10 if it's all in one slot. So you might choose 2 to 3. Images are fantastic. They're a great way to visually tell what your organization or your project does or has done. And they can obviously enliven an application. You can certainly include, for at least your project grants, again, as Molly said, fellowships are different, but for your project grants, you could simply include an image file in one of the slots designated, or you could even make your images into a PDF on a single page, so you include more than one on a 1 to 2 page document and include that as a support material. And you're going to want to relate back the support materials that you're providing to review criteria. Hold on one moment, please. So as Molly said, public value is a criteria for the project grants for individuals and for the arts access grants. That public value ask criteria is different in project grants for education, where it's curriculum connection, and in project grants for healthcare, where I believe it is healthcare connection. In each of those programs, the public value ask component is 5 points of the score. Artistic merit for all the programs is also a criteria. It is 10 points of the score that a panel gives. And then another 5 points that is true across most project grant programs is clarity and achievability. So you want to think about how your support materials relate to each of those criteria within a grant program. So for artistic merit, certainly images or videos or resumes or CVs of an artist's work can function to support a panel's evaluation of that criteria. Press or marketing collateral are things that can show a history of work that you have done and how it's been received. So that can, again, speak to clarity and achievability, as well as a list of quotes. So if you do a program, let's say where you serve younger people, if you had some kind of document that summarized or shared, anonymized responses that they gave about your program, maybe through a survey or through a conversation, testimonials of sorts that can speak to clarity and achievability, as well as probably artistic merit or public value. And then lastly, letters of support. Some people ask members of their community to write letters of support for their project, people that have been most affected by it, or they will ask partners in the program or in the project to write letters of support as well. Again, those are all things that enliven the written narrative of application. So we are going to pause and actually look together at a example budget for an organization called the Rosenbaum Singers. You know when exactly to hit start. So as mentioned, this is a sample grant or an example grant budget that we're going to look at for a hypothetical organization called the Rosenbaum Singers. You can see that they have pivoted their project for the pandemic, and they are doing a summer 2021 virtual concert. And there's a lot of great things about this budget that I'm going to walk through with you. If you would like to see a copy of this budget yourself, one of the things you can do is look on the blog support post for this grant cycle, and you will see that a copy of the budget has been provided there. So the first thing to note, we're looking at the income side of the budget here. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit, and you see on line F where it says total income. You'll note that the total income there is comprised of the subtotal cash income, meaning the other income sources you have supporting a project other than your RISCA grant, and then the RISCA grant itself. And that total is $8,050. You'll also see that this project has $1,500 in in-kind support. I'll scroll up here so you can see in-kind there is the name of that column. If we look down at the expense side of the budget, the bottom of the expense side, we see that total cash expenses, meaning those expenses, you are asked to attribute the money that you're requesting from RISCA to various expenses, and you're asked to attribute the money that you're receiving from other sources to various expenses. That total is $8,050. And again, the in-kind total is $1,500. The thing that might be a change or a shift in mindset or just something new for you all to think about is that when you're writing budgets for projects to RISCA and to many granting entities, you're going to want to write the budgets so that they balance, so that you're showing no surplus income and also no deficit. Now, we recognize that in reality, it's going to look a lot different, right? When you actually get to executing this program, maybe you make a little bit of money, quote unquote, or maybe you don't, you have a little bit of a deficit. That's fine. What you're doing is thinking about your program in this idealized future. So please envision that idealized future that you're going to have a balanced budget. Let's look back up at the income side. So one of the things that makes this budget a strong budget is that it has a variety of income sources supporting the project. The more revenue streams, the more a project is perceived as being feasible, often by a panel. However, we do recognize as an agency, and panelists are oriented to recognize, that many communities do not have the accumulated wealth or affluence to support projects that are important to their community through cash. They definitely do that through other means, which is where in-kind support can become really important. I'll get into some detail about what the in-kind support line item in this particular budget reflects. But the thing to know about in-kind support is when a third party, so someone unrelated to your project, meaning they're not a board member or they're not on staff, donates a good or service that has a market value to support your project. So this could be a restaurant donating food. It could be a business donating water bottles. It could be a graphic designer, who donates their time and services to your project. It could also be a media entity that gives you a discount on advertising your program in their media outlet. So that is, again, a really great way to show public value. And again, if you think back about the review criteria we mentioned, for those programs that have public value as a review criteria, showing in-kind support is a really great way to reflect that in the budget as well as in the narrative. Scrolling down, and again, we'll talk a little bit about what is in those line items a little bit later on the second page of this budget. We look at expenses. As I mentioned, you are asked to show where you are going to spend the RISCA money that you're requesting, and also how you're using the other money that you have as income coming into the project to support your other expenses. So you can see here that this particular program, the Rosenbaum Singers, they attributed the entire request that they made to RISCA for artistic fees for their program. This is a really great idea because one of the values we have as an agency is paying artists and arts administrators for their time, because their time is incredibly valuable and should be, valued as such. So that is one place to consider putting your RISCA share of money. You will see that there are certain things that money requested from RISCA cannot be used for, such as fundraising, re-grants of prizes and awards, or purchase of equipment, etc. It could be that those things exist as a part of your program, but you do not want to use RISCA funds for that. And you'll want to talk with the program director managing your program about how to best reflect the reality and totality of your project in your project grant budget. You remember that I said above that there was $1,500 in-kind support that was quote unquote coming from other support. You can see here that that other support translated expense-wise into $500 in-kind for advertising and PR, and $1,000 in-kind for space rental and utilities. Let's look at the second page of this document now together. That'll give you more depth about what these different numbers mean. And it is one of the really awesome things I think about our project grant budgets. For those of you who are new to making budgets, this can feel overwhelming, right? And I'm going to talk about how to go about starting this process. But the really great thing is that we have budget notes. Here's where you can explain your reasoning behind your numbers. So when you're making a budget, I'll say this again in a little bit, but you're going to want to start with the expense side because that's probably the easiest thing to do, right? Expenses can be very concrete. So you can research them. You can talk to friends who might know how much these various things cost because maybe they've done something similar if it's new to you. And then you're going to want to let that inform your numbers. And in the cases where you're having to extrapolate when it comes to income, certainly, you just want to, give your best logic behind your numbers. So for instance, for other earned income in this project, we see that they're assuming online program ad income. And because they haven't done the program yet, they don't know what they're going to get. So they're assuming a 25% decrease over last year's concerts program ad income due to the pandemic. Sounds like a reasonable thing to do, right? So they're at least communicating to the panel their logic behind their numbers. If we look at other forms of income that they're receiving, you can see they've requested $1,500 in money from the Flanagan Bank Foundation. It's really important to indicate whether or not funds have been requested or secured. And you can see under other support, they requested $1,000 from Tree Board Charities, and they've done the appropriate thing where they mark it with an asterisk to let the panelists know that this money has been secured. Lastly, on the income side, you can see they describe their in-kind here. So if you remember, it was $500 in donated advertising. This was a program ad donated by the Rhode Island Summer Fund Program Guide. Total aside, that does not exist. That's not a real thing. It was made up for this budget. And they also received donated rehearsal and performance space, recording space, I should say, from the Community Arts Center, which is also a made-up place, at 5 days valued at $200 a day. And they attributed that, if you remember on the first page, to on the income side, just be other support, $1,500 in other support. On the expense side, it's pretty clear where they had to put that, as you will see in the budget notes in the second page. The thing to know when it comes to income, because we're dealing with very generic categories, put the numbers where it makes the most sense to you and just communicate it in the budget notes what you did. That's what's great about the budget notes. You just kind of simply and clearly state, again, acknowledging how much time they're going to have to read things, what you did and why you did it. And that just kind of covers you and just allows the panelists to know what your thinking is. Don't worry about it being, quote unquote, correct. So again, on the expense side here, you can see they're just discussing what their expenses are. So they're breaking out what their artistic fees were, their personnel expenses, very simply and very clearly. They're discussing what they're using their PR budget numbers for, or the money they have associated with PR and advertising. And again, remaining operating expenses are just indicating sound equipment and temporary stage rental, things that are very easy to research. You don't need to communicate in the budget notes unless you really feel strongly about it, the source for the information for which you are determining the cost of these things. You can just simply do as it is here and just show what those numbers are. And then lastly, we have the in-kind space for people to talk about their income and expense numbers in two different spots. I would just suggest putting the same information in both places. That way the panelists can see it in both places. So that is it for us covering the budget. We are now going to pause and move back to our regular presentation. So again, just to reiterate the signs of a good budget. Again, the budget needs to be in balance, which means that the income equal expenses. The budget should show, or ideally, should show diverse income sources. We know that's not going to be feasible for a lot of communities, particularly for our grants where it's a project grant for individual artists. So you can also reflect income in terms of diverse kinds of in-kind support for a project as well. We like to see as an agency, and it's based on our strategic plan that was developed through community input, money going to pay artists and arts administrators for their time. And lastly, providing simple explanations in the budget notes for how you arrived at the numbers you did. It makes all the difference in the world, and it will also make you feel a lot more comfortable in the numbers that you are presenting. So as I mentioned, when you're making a budget, you want to start with the expense side and research how much things cost, or do the research where necessary. I did not mention this, but then you want to move to the income side of the budget and think about what are the various funding sources for my project. Then you want to do the hard work, which is make it balance out. So what will often happen, because obviously this is just life, is we will have more expenses than we will have projected income sometimes. So you might consider where you can shift your expenses, where you might pursue seeing you can get something donated or something in kind, or consider if you really truly need it for this given project. Then you want to, again, just to reiterate 1,000 times, pay yourself and your artist for your time. You as the arts administrator, the individual coordinating this given program, as well as the artist that you were hiring. And then you want to make sure your budget is consistent with your narrative. So this might seem more complex than it is, but if you're talking about doing an outdoor festival and the panel doesn't see in your budget, any line items related to an outdoor stage or any of the things that one would imagine are necessary for the accomplishing of an outdoor festival, they might start questioning the clarity and achievability of a project. So make sure that that consistency of what you're talking about in your narrative is reflected in your budget where necessary. So if you need more help beyond this grant workshop, we 100% are available to you. The earlier you get to us, the better, because as you can imagine, we have a lot of people who are pursuing support, but even if it's late in the game, it never hurts to reach out. We are going to have one-on-one meetings available with Molly Flanagan for project grants for individuals, one-on-one meetings with me, Todd Trebor, for arts access grants, which are our project grants for organizations, and one-on-one meetings with Maggie Anderson, who manages our project grants for educations, all of whom you've heard their voices speaking today. So the way to sign up for those one-on-one meetings is to go to the blog support post for this grant cycle, and you'll see that there are links there for you to sign up for meetings. You can also 100% just email us. You can easily find our emails on the staff website or on that blog support page. We will also have drop-in hours where you can just drop into a Zoom session, if you have questions, on the last remaining final days leading up to the grant deadline. So if you can't get a one-on-one meeting, or if you just find you have a random question, there will be a staff person there that can answer those for you. You can also, and this goes beyond obviously the grants themselves, join one of our Facebook resource groups. If we were in an actual live workshop, we would just drop those links into the presentation. But these are both Facebook groups that are publicly findable on Facebook. They are intended as peer support groups and places where we share resources, and you can share resources as well that will help fellow Rhode Island arts administrators or artists and creatives. For the arts administrators of Rhode Island Facebook group, we post things like grant opportunities that are happening in the community, resources around marketing or fundraising, notifications about upcoming workshops that might support nonprofits in the work that they do, either building capacity or perhaps pursuing different kinds of financial support. The Artists and Creatives Facebook group frequently has artist calls there. So if you're an artist that is up for that, you can join that group and receive access to those calls and information. You can also post your own opportunities there as well. Again, they're intended as peer support groups. You can ask questions and post resources that you have to share or receive resources that others share, but they are not intended as vehicles to promote programs that you are doing or classes that you are running, etc. And just to finish up, we wanted to just share with you again who the program staff are managing the various programs. Myself, Todd Trebor, who manages the Arts Access Grant Program. Molly Flanagan, whose voice you heard, who manages the project grants for individuals this cycle. Our colleague, Elena Calderon-Patino, who manages our folk arts program as well as the expansion arts program. There is not a deadline this cycle for that, for the folk arts program. It won't be until October. Maggie Anderson, who manages our education grants, and then our executive director, Randy Rosenbaum, who will be managing our project grants in healthcare for this cycle. Thank you so much for joining us, and reach out, please, if you have any questions.